Alright, flipped video for Rise of Industrialism. You should have your note sheet with you, and if you notice at the top of your note sheet, it has the unit objectives that it covers. Remember, I gave you that sheet at the beginning. It would be in your best interest as you go through this to fill out those unit objectives so that you have them all in one place later, but I'll leave that up to you. So we are looking at how the country changes economically after the Civil War. So we're going to look at the rise of industrialism, and what we're going to see is this change to a new type of economy, one that's based on manufacturing instead of agriculture. So we see factories, machines, mining, railroad, all these type of heavy industry things that we never had before start coming about. So the economy changes, and the people that live and work in the country are also going to have to change with that. So the first thing that we kind of see is a little bit of a before and after. Before, most things were raw materials to things that you could make by hand, like clothes or even wood to ships, barrels, etc. But all the same types of industry that have happened in this country for the extended period of time before the Civil War. So we don't see a lot of heavy manufacturing. After the Civil War, after the conflict is over with the Transcontinental Railroad expanding and some of the other things, we see a lot of heavy industry, things like railroad tracks, steam engines, farm tractors, and a bunch of other things, but a different type of things that you work in a factory for, as opposed to a small shop or at home or something like that. So what we're looking at is a situation where goods are made in factories and not by hand, as the new method, and that's going to lead to some things we talk about later with urbanization, people moving to work next to to live by the factories that they're going to work in. So probably the most important industry at this point is steel making. When you think about building the railroad and you think about building factories and things, and steel making is going to be dominated by Andrew Carnegie, and we'll look at him a little bit in class. But his Bethlehem Steel Company is sort of the dominant company in the steel industry. So what we're going to see is part of this increase in manufacturing, and these two things are linked. It's not like manufacturing comes just because of this, but it's not like this comes just because of manufacturing. So a technology boom happens. Good examples of this are the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell, and then Thomas Edison. 1,000 patents are issued to him between the start of his laboratory in 1876 and his death in 1931, and that's just one person. So we have inventions all over the place, and those inventions are going to help us be more efficient workers. They're going to help us with consumer goods. They're going to help us with new products. They're going to help us make things better and faster. So the U.S. Patent Office sees roughly 676,000 patents issued in the 40-year period before 1900, which, if you look at the number on the screen, that's quite a few compared to the 70 years before. So technology helps to spur on the increase in industrialism. They're related to each other. Along those lines, a worker in 1886 could make 3 times as much stuff in 10 hours on average as one worker could in 14 hours in 1840. So 26 years, over 3 times the increase in productivity. And that's because of increased manufacturing techniques and increased things that have technology-based applications. So you can make things in a factory, processes got better, management got better. But the idea is that makes for a more efficient economy. That also means you need less workers. So your question, think about positives and negatives. You can make more things, but you don't need as many people. So think about how that would impact the economy and kind of give your opinion on what would be good about that and what would be bad about it. It's very similar to some of the stuff we've seen go on the last few years in the auto industry. So other inventions, mechanical reapers, increased agricultural efficiency, blast furnace increased efficiency in the steel industry, electric motors, light bulbs, steel ships, petroleum, and the list would go on and on. That's just a couple of those things that were there. So what we're going to look at next is national markets, and this is the idea that instead of just selling to the people that lived around you in your city or state, now you're going to be able to sell to people all across the country. And that's really important because it allows for bigger factories and allows for things to be produced in one place. So the railroad industry and the shipping industry really lead to a national market, because now I can make something and get it somewhere efficiently, and I can also get raw materials. So a good example of this would be kind of a before and after. In the meat industry, before this time period, you'd have to buy meat from a butcher who bought it from a local farmer. Everything was produced right by you. Now they would take the cattle that graze on the Great Plains, like we talked about before, ship it to a packing center in Chicago, who then they would harvest the meat or butcher the cattle, package everything, and ship it out around the country. That made it cheaper. It also, in some ways, made it worse, and we'll talk a little bit about that in class. But the idea is that now things are cheaper and faster, and without the railroad and being able to get things on time, this probably would not have happened. So, why my picture's crooked, I don't know. But anyway, if you want to look at the crooked picture, you'd be able to see that the graph shows the number of railroads. So this is pretty much, as things get better about this time period, this is how many miles of railroad tracks that we see as you go up in the time period. So the railroad increases kind of along with all this stuff. So other things that we see as far as industry, the railroad cars become refrigerated, which really changes that. So Gustavus Swift comes up with this idea, let's refrigerate the railroad cars, which helps facilitate the increase of the packing industry. So by the 1890s, 5 companies dominated the meat industry. We also see fruits and vegetables available year-round for the first time. So it used to be if you couldn't grow it at that season, you couldn't get it because it would spoil. Well, now we can refrigerate it and ship it all over. So people are getting food that they couldn't get before in off-season, which is a huge change in people's diets. We also see on this national market thing, things like National Retail Network. Some of the first companies to have that were the McCormick Harvesting Company and the Singer Sewing Company. We also see 5 and dime stores become popular, especially in the cities. Small department stores replacing catalog things. And then we see the small grocery stores starting to be eliminated by companies like the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. Birth of consumerism. The idea is people start spending their money differently. Instead of buying everything from the person right next to you or making it yourself, buying raw materials and making things. Now it's the idea is you can buy finished products. You can buy all these new consumer goods, all these fancy things. So all of a sudden it becomes a cool thing to shop, and it becomes something that's enjoyable. Before that, you went and bought something when you needed to. But as people move to the cities, these large department stores increase. And a couple examples, Marshall Field in Chicago, Macy's, New York, and John Mason in Boston. These guys all open these huge stores, and they make them lavish and pretty and nice. And it's the idea that it's fun to shop, and that was new, kind of a new phenomenon for the average person. We have innovators like John Wanamaker who come up with the idea of fixed price instead of bartering for prices, which traditionally you could go in and negotiate a price. Well, now everything's going to be the same price, so you get the best price and everybody gets it. So it's more efficient. And he also came up with the idea of window displays to lure people in that were walking by in the street. So as people move to the cities, these new types of stores pop up, and what that does is increases spending. And it increases the idea that you need to have stuff to be happy. So along with that, advertising increases. Think about this. In 30 years, advertising in the country went up 100 times. So from 500 million in 1870 to 540 million in 1900. How is that going to affect the country? Think about that a little bit. Your question has something to do with that. What's the idea? Is that positive or is that negative? Does that help people or hurt people? So kind of the last thing that we have here is the growth of big business, along with factories, along with consumerism, along with national markets. Companies get larger and larger, which makes sense. If you have to have a factory to own something, the bigger your factory is, the more efficient you can make something, the better you can get, better prices you can get from the railroad, the better prices you can get from your suppliers, the cheaper you can ship things, and ultimately the cheaper you can sell things. So you get a big price advantage from this. So we have a couple things along with this idea of big business. Management has to change. You can't have one person managing a big business like you used to. So it used to be, for example, in the railroad companies, one guy would take and manage all the aspects of one small part of track. So 70, 80, 90 miles. Well, now you have railroad companies that own thousands of miles of tracks, and obviously one person can't do it all. So they split the management up into little jobs. So things like, instead of managing the whole track, you would just manage, is the track maintained? And then one guy would manage, is everything being shipped on time? And another guy would manage the finances. And before that, that was new. So as companies grow, the management structure of these companies changes. So, and along with that, we're going to see kind of two vocab words here, vertical and horizontal mergers. Okay, so as companies start to grow, there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of change. As technologies get better, efficiency increases. You don't need as many workers. You need more workers. You need more money. You have to have more money to build a bigger factory to be efficient. So kind of a lot of volatility, and companies start to combine. So instead of 10 small companies, it's better if you have one big company. You can make it cheaper and you can make more money. So companies merge or come together to join in two different ways, vertically and horizontally. A vertical merger is when you join up the supply chain, which basically means you buy the companies above or below you. So if you look at that little graph, if you were a steel company, you'd buy the companies that made the raw materials, and then you buy the company that shipped the steel after. So you buy the companies below you or above you in the supply chain. If you are a horizontal merger, is when you buy competing businesses. So a horizontal merger would be if GM bought Ford and Chrysler and made one big car company that dominated the market. A vertical merger would be if GM bought a steel company so they controlled steel production, and they bought a railroad company so they controlled how they could ship it. Those are the difference. So make sure you define those two things on your sheet. Example of a big business here is up in this corner is John Rockefeller, and this is kind of typical. We're going to talk about these robber baron guys a little bit in class, but he's one guy that 30 years it takes him to dominate the oil market. So he goes from one guy that owns a refining company making kerosene to owning 40 companies which control 84% of the nation's oil in less than 40 years. And why that's important for him is he could actually negotiate better shipping prices. So on the railroad, he would ship his oil for 10 cents a barrel, where other guys would have to ship it for 34 cents a barrel. Okay? And that means obviously he can make more money. He can basically say, this is the price I want for shipping it, and you either do it or I don't go with you, and then you're out of business. So he could pretty much dominate the oil industry with his Standard Oil Company. This is the name of it. So we're going to look at some of those other companies, these guys that just completely dominate different industries and how that affects the economy. But they become known as robber barons, which is sort of like a derogative or negative name. There's ultra-rich guys, or in most cases guys, that had flashy displays of wealth. So they would build huge, massive houses. Vanderbilt built an $11 million house back then, solid gold toilets. Okay, so people see these things and they don't really like this, and it's kind of like they're robbing from their employees because they're not paying their employees very much, and we'll talk about that a little bit more with labor unions. But they become known as sort of stealing from the poor person so that they can be ultra rich, and we'll look at some political cartoons in class that have to deal with that. And sort of as a response to this, Mark Twain comes up with this name in an essay called The Gilded Age, sort of this messed up situation where some people are getting super rich, but things aren't really as they seem. Things aren't going that well. It's a negative term for the age, and it just means that things are a little bit off. They're not right. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in class as well. But along with this idea of big business comes this idea that Herbert Spencer puts forth called social Darwinism. And it's based on Charles Darwin's natural selection. It's just applied to business. What's important about it is it's only the strong survive. And so the strong, the rich people, the industrialists, the ones that control the economy think this is the greatest thing ever because they can now say, all right, that's good. Government, this makes sense. We should be crushing competition. This is what should happen. This is how it happens in nature. It should happen here. So they use social Darwinism as a way to promote limited government interference, to let them dominate, to create monopolies and trust and some of the other things that we're going to talk more about. But they come to use this as sort of their argument for why nobody should mess with them, why it's okay that my business is big, because that's how it should happen. That's how it would happen in nature. So one other thing to note, and we'll talk about Andrew Carnegie a little bit more in class, but not all the guys that were rich were quote-unquote robber barons. Some of them were a little bit different. Andrew Carnegie was quoted as saying, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." He gave away lots and lots of money. He saw it as his way of his job to make a lot of money so that he could help other people. And he saw that as more efficient than everybody making a little bit of money and spending it. He thought if he made a whole bunch of money that he could help more people than if they had a little bit of money and didn't know what to do with it. So, but that's not typical of this age. For the most part, most of these guys keep their money and have just vast fortunes, and we're going to spend some more time talking about that in class. If there's any of the questions you missed, make sure you go back and get those. You need to have this to me on Thursday.